The first decade of Chinese involvement on the Otago goldfields was to be a golden period. Discrimination levels were initially low, and the gold returns generally high. Chinese parties spread rapidly through inland Otago, so already in 1866 groups had arrived here in the lower Nevis. By 1869 there were over 300 Chinese miners working in this area. In the 1870s their numbers were so significant that European entrepreneurs set up stores and support services to cater to that particular market. The hunt for gold was a fickle business. Even rich gold-bearing areas like here we are at Blacks, later renamed Ophir after the fabulous mythical city of gold, gives you a hint of what a rich gold-bearing area it was. But by the 1870s it had been pretty much abandoned, and it was really revived by Chinese miners coming here. There was a couple of hundred of them. Had a camp up here on the terrace south of the township, between the terrace and the historic Daniel O'Connell Memorial Bridge here, and they really revived the Blacks goldfield. I'm pretty happy about that actually, because my great-great-grandmother built a hotel here around about that time, and no doubt prospered from the renewed activity in the Blacks area. Here we are in Drybread. It's one of the more picturesquely named settlements of the Otago goldfields. There's nothing left here apart from this graveyard. But my grandmother was born here in the 1890s, and her grandfather, John Mallor, this is his tomb, the most impressive one in the whole cemetery actually, so I feel quite like the king of the place. He was a storekeeper. He also had a hotel, interests in gold mines all around the place. But as a storekeeper, he was pretty chuffed, I think, in the 1870s when this area, which had been dying away, was revived by hundreds of Chinese gold seekers coming through here. Now we've seen lots of Chinese merchants and stores and things, and you might think that they only patronised their own. That wasn't true. The Chinese miners were really good customers for storekeepers on the goldfields like my great-great-grandfather. The best thing about them was, unlike a lot of European miners who wanted credit and things on tick, the Chinese miners, they bought up big and they paid on the nail. They were damn good customers. Behind me we have one of the most iconic old goldfields hotels in Otago, the Cardrona Hotel. And here we are at Cardrona, a really remote place. To get here from Dunedin, it's 350 kilometres over the high mountain roads, very difficult of access. It's one of those goldfield communities that by the end of the 1860s was really fading away, and the coming of the Chinese revitalised its fortunes. So in 1870 there were only 30 European miners still working around this area, and 400 Chinese came to stimulate the goldfields economy again. But it wasn't just the Otago economy benefiting. Men were returning with or sending back large sums to China for their efforts. Here we are in the Canton diggings in the Waikaia River. This is one of the most successful sites of Otago's Chinese gold seekers anywhere. It had previously been worked by Europeans, but they had been unsuccessful. This is a very challenging site. It's prone to flooding on the one hand and difficult to drain. Chinese bought the claim in 1883, and thereafter they applied their own particular skills. If we look over here, we can see the stacked rocks of the wall. They diverted the river so they could get at the riverbed, but it's also said that somewhere near here, Chinese for the first time used water pumps to divert the water instead of a tail race. Whatever they did, they were incredibly successful here, and some Chinese from this area went back to Guangdong with 900 ounces of gold, a true fortune. In the 1880s there was a significant turn against the Chinese from the wider community. In the 1860s and 70s they had been seen as a solution to Otago's problem of a lack of labour on the goldfields, but by the 1880s diminishing gold returns, an economic downturn generally in the economy, and competition for work meant that the Chinese were seen as alien competitors. And where they moved into successful claims like this one, the Canton diggings, and by dint of hard work, perseverance and methodical methods, reaped the rewards with significant gold returns. There was a lot of jealousy by Europeans who said that the Chinese didn't leave a speck of gold behind them, they cleaned the place out. Of course, that was the very idea.
They were meticulous in finding gold, but they worked in a way that the strongest one would do the heavy lifting and the shoveling, and then the ones who were more capable would do the washing and cradling, and the ones who were not so capable but which could still sit there would do the gold panning to wash the gravel and pick up the fine bits of gold. So it was a case of fitting the job to suit the capability of the man. And then the ones who were less capable then looked after serving the food and the care. So there was people looking after the campsite in care for the ones that were doing the physical work. So it was like a small community.
Many of the new miners that were arriving directly from China had little experience or knowledge of gold mining. Why then were they so successful? The answer is evident at the Potter's diggings, high up on the Old Man Range.
So here we are in the Potter's goldfield, perhaps the most isolated of all the Otago goldfields. Over 200 kilometres to Dunedin from here, 150 kilometres to Queenstown, and bringing in supplies here you had to pack them in over very broken rough trails. Even so, by late 1862 there were over 400 European miners working up here. The Chinese arrived later and, as in so many cases, reworked the old ground that had been left abandoned, and by dint of perseverance, hard work and working together in teams, managed to win a bit of gold from up here. But boy, was it an isolated place. The gold seekers were rural peasants from Canton, and they didn't have a tradition of gold mining in that area. What they did have were sturdy skills of using water and its power, and a heritage of hard work, frugality and cooperative work. And all those things came together when parties of miners came here searching for gold, and they applied them. And you can see down here, for instance, behind me, the results of applying that skill with water and that capacity for hard, methodical, cooperative work, and the way in which the miners have shifted the rocks out of the riverbed. They've channeled the water to drive it free and to get at the alluvial base of the river, and it would have been really rich in many parts of this stream going all the way up the top of the hill, and those tail ends you can see go all the way up there. Now we often think about the elderly Chinese fossickers who survived at the end of the gold seeking era, but this work reminds us of that period in the 1870s and 80s when it was young men who came here in great teams, united by their family, their clan and their county loyalties, and devoted to succeeding in the search for gold so that they could support their home communities and their own families and return to China with honour, as so many of them did. So this is a desolate and isolated landscape, quite beautiful but very remote, very forbidding. And you have to imagine those miners that were here living in this very isolated environment, even with all the support they had from their mates. They were also supported in a chain that stretched all the way back, 10,000 kilometres to Guangdong. There were the home villages. There they came down to Hong Kong, the ships were laid on. They came across the sea, down to Dunedin, grub-staked by merchants, up through the inland route, stopping off at different points along the way. Again, the merchants over there in Roxburgh, down in Waikaya, getting their gear, and up here. And all the time, information flowing back to China and back to a place as remote as this, where amazingly the miners ate Chinese food. They lived a Chinese lifestyle. And what was it all for? Gold and a return to China.
Back in China, the efforts of the men were welcomed. The money that began to return was a welcome boost for their struggling home communities.
Three clans in particular came from Shek Ma village, the Chans, the Lais and the Wongs, many of whose men went out to New Zealand, to Otago in particular. They sent money home, of course, and the Chan Ancestral Hall, for instance, here behind me, the finest one in the village back in the 19th century, was built almost entirely from remittances sent home from men in Otago on the west coast. And just beside it, of course, there's a defensive tower. They also would have sent money back to build that to help defend the village, which was in the middle of a zone replete with banditry and attacks of all sorts going on.
Obviously, these villages have been modernised considerably over the decades, but many village ponds and examples of the use of water remain, ingenuity in the use of water was one of the biggest assets for the Chinese in Otago.
Look, here we are in the Shekhan Reserve, up the Fraser River, not far from Alexandria in the Old Man Range. It's a very isolated spot, very difficult to access. But here were groups of Chinese miners working intensively together, and there are various remains up here of their activities, including a longhouse. Now the name gives it away. It was long because it accommodated numbers of men, and it testifies to the nature of Chinese gold mining, which was generally in very big cooperative work parties. Now they would often work claims of 5 to 6 acres, and they would do so with very labour-intensive sort of methods, which minimised the amount of machinery they needed to use, and also, the critical factor, the use of water. But they could scale up their activities or scale them down depending on the number of men available, the richness of the ground, the nature of the tasks at hand. And that sometimes, that effectiveness caused jealousy among the Europeans. There are contemporary descriptions describing Chinese parties as working like beeves around a honey hive. So, you know, that sort of gives away a little bit of sense of that jealousy. And they often worked longer hours per day than Europeans, which again added to a sense of resentment about their effectiveness and their cooperative methods. Now, Big Stone Ditch is what Shekhan means in Cantonese, and the name itself is a reminder of the prodigious efforts that went on up here to move masses of rock to get at the gold-bearing dirt beneath, and the way in which those Cantonese parties used water so efficiently, so effectively, to get their work done, to make it remunerative so they could get back to China. And this ruin of a gold seeker era cottage is fascinating for the Chinese characteristic in this arrangement between the fireplace and the doorway. Cantonese superstition had it that, you know, evil spirits wandered about the place and you wanted to keep them out of your dwelling house. And there were various ways of doing that, and this disposition between the fireplace and the doorway is one way. Now, in other places in Otago, like the Arrowtown Chinese camp, we see similar arrangements with the disposition of the buildings, internal structures like this, reflecting Cantonese architecture and beliefs. Whereas in others, like the Lawrence Joss House, the building itself is completely European, a cottage in its architectural form. But it's great to see this because it reminds us that Cantonese people brought with them their belief system and laid them on the ground in a physical way here, far, far from the Cantonese homeland, right in Otago.
In 1985, when David Longy made a visit to Guangdong, wanting to see the sorts of places that New Zealand's pioneer Chinese had come from, this village, Pongwu, was the one that he was shown as typical of the origin point for the Cantonese gold seekers. In fact, if you look at Don's famous register, his roll of Chinese with all those names of the men and where they came from, there are probably more entries for Pongwu than just about any other village. So this really is typical of the places that New Zealand's pioneer Chinese came from.
Here we are in the Beaumont Gorge. Behind me is the mighty Mata'o, the Clutha River. The great challenge for miners in the past was how to get the gold out of the river. And the Chinese, working together in dedicated teams, were able to do great things here. So this particular stretch is the site of, we know, in the 1870s and right through the 90s, efforts by big teams of Chinese miners to divert the channel of the river by building a wing dam out into the current, thereby exposing the riverbed such they could get at the gold that was in there. So they made good returns along here, and it was one of the last places along the whole river in the 1890s they were still doing that. But there's a famous story of the wing dam efforts here being regularly washed out by high water, and the next year the Chinese groups would come back here and have another crack, and they'd build it out, build it out, build it out, and they'd have some success, and then the river would rise and wash it all away. So they were incredibly tenacious, had great teamwork, and that was something that really distinguished the efforts of the Chinese from all the other groups who were active in this area. Now, the newspaper of the day went so far in the 1890s to pay a tribute to the dedication of the miners. And here's what they said: "These Chinamen are above all plucky and incapable either of admitting failure, bowing to difficulties, or sitting down to hard luck. They are above all things stickers, and are besides very ingenious and resourceful in work of this kind. Here we are in Switzer's village, an amazing goldfield site. Really, the village site itself had to be shifted 3 times. They kept finding that the ground it had been built on was rich with gold, so they had to move it. Chinese came here pretty early in the piece. You know, we know they arrived first in Otago at the beginning of 1866. By 1868, they were already down here, and they dominated this area up to the mid-1880s, in fact. There were over 1,000 Chinese gold seekers in Waikaya for much of that time. They were seen as rather secretive. Of course, they didn't speak English. The first arrivals looked very different with their Chinese costume and their pigtails and so on. But they adopted very innovative techniques here. They introduced water pumps and other Chinese innovations, and that made a real difference. The golden terrace behind me was a particularly rich goldfield area. We're not quite sure how much gold was extracted, but it's been estimated up to 12 tonnes of gold was taken out of this area. That's a massive amount of gold, and quite a lot of that found its way back to China. Mining's a messy business. Doesn't really matter what type of mining technology is used, it leaves scars on the landscapes that endure for years. But one of the things about the Chinese miners was that they were very neat, very methodical. And if you look behind me here in the winding creek on Awatiri Station, you can see 100 years plus after the last Chinese miners were here, the neatness of the tailings that they left behind. It's really impressive. One of the pubs in Old Switzer's township was known as the All Nations, and that really sums up the nature of the goldfields community here over the period of gold seeking. People came from all over the world, and this cross really symbolises that quite beautifully, because the bits of crockery which were taken from rubbish scatters in the goldfields huts indeed come from all over the world, including China. Now, one of the most remembered buildings in Old Switzer's was the Chinese gambling den, where people came to play Fantan. And unusually, actually, for such premises, Europeans were quite welcome to participate there as well, and did so. Now, with their rural background in Guangdong, the Chinese gold seekers brought with them great traditions of vegetable growing, planting fruit trees, and they did all those things around their camps and their settlements here to supplement their diet to begin with. But later on, as the gold returns diminished and they had to look for alternative forms of income, they began to develop bigger market gardens and supply fruit and vegetables to communities all over Otago. And of course later on they did that across New Zealand. It became a very recognisable niche for Chinese post-gold. But if we go to a lot of older settlements, like here in Dean's Orchard just outside Waikaya, we can find these old fruit trees, and oftentimes in Otago they will have been planted by Chinese gold seekers.
The 1870s were the pinnacle for Chinese in terms of goldfields earnings. The remittances sent back to China saw a slow surge in infrastructure improvements. The Otago provincial government usually kept its guarantees to protect the Chinese. But trouble loomed. In 1876, the New Zealand provincial government system was abolished. Those who had made the guarantees to the Chinese were no longer in power. As an economic recession set in, trouble was on the horizon. By 1881, a £10 poll tax had been introduced for arriving Chinese. So, for the Cantonese of Otago, the golden days were over.